One. Welcome to the FT's live business clinic with me, Claer Barrett. I'm the personal finance editor at the FT. I'll be live on air for the next 30 minutes, taking questions from you, our small business readers, with my colleague Andy Bounds, the FT's enterprise editor. Now, today we want to talk to small business leaders about how they are planning to take their businesses through the lockdown. The measures are being eased in different speeds across the UK, confusingly different in England than they are for Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. But we are going to get some more news today. After we come off air, the Chancellor is due to stand up in the House of Commons, Rishi Sunak, to give more details about what's going to happen to the furlough scheme, which is already supporting millions of workers. And later on, we're going to hear more from Business Secretary Ashok Sharma, who will be setting out more details of how the lockdown unravelling will help businesses. Now, in the meantime, we want to hear today from you. What do you make of the guidance that the government has been issuing? What are the policies that you would like to hear more clarity on? And apart from that, what is your plan to get your own business back moving again? Tell us the steps that you're considering and the challenges that you think you're facing. So you can ask us questions in lots of ways. If you're watching this within the ft.com article, just comment on the bottom of that article. Or if you're watching on YouTube, send us a message in the live chat. Or if you're watching us on LinkedIn, hello to all of the people who are logging in on there. Again, just put a message in the live chat and the team will pick it up and send it to me on my iPad, and I can put the question to Andy Bounds. So Andy, thanks for joining us today. Let's start with some questions for you. I mean, first of all, tell us what you made of all of the guidance that the government issued yesterday. There was quite a lot of it.
There was indeed. There were 8 different papers addressing each individual area of the economy that they're looking to reopen. So there's a lot of useful stuff in there. It has to be said, an awful lot of it is advisory, suggestions. It's still unclear exactly what measures you should take if you want to go back to work. They're basically inviting employers to use their common sense. So, for example, in the construction paper, it says if you've got an area where people have to hand tools to each other, maybe have a bin where they put the tool in the bin and somebody else comes and picks it out the bin, so people aren't getting within 2 meters of each other. Social distancing remains the key. So whatever you're doing in your workplace, you have to try your best to maintain that social distance. If you can't, there's nothing in the regulations to say that you can't go back to work, but obviously your employees may be uncomfortable, and therefore lots and lots of cleaning. Just think about ways in which you could run your business differently. Think about the pressure points, the areas where you get lots of people coming in all at the same time into a lobby, wherever it may be. How can you stagger that? It's those kind of points that you're being urged to think about.
And broadly speaking, the guidance, although it was issued on a sector by sector basis, lots of it was broadly the same. But again, if you've got a question for us about that, then please either comment on the article or put the question in the live feed and we'll get to it later. But Andy, obviously we're going to hear a lot more from the Chancellor later on today and then the Business Secretary. What kind of things do you think they're going to reveal?
Well, the Chancellor will be talking about the furlough scheme in particular, because obviously we know the lockdown is going to, this strange world we're in is going to continue for a little bit more longer. Therefore, he's likely to extend that furlough scheme beyond the end of June, which will be a relief to many businesses. But he's unlikely to keep it at 80%. He's probably going to reduce it maybe 60%. And the idea is that, and a lot of businesses have been calling for this, to be honest. What if I want somebody to come back 1 or 2 days a week? For example, if I'm running a business that's not as busy as it used to be, I might only want to work a couple of days a week, or I might want to only open the mornings, or I might not have enough packing work, every day. But I need an employee to come in a couple of times a week. Then you'll be able to do that, which I think is a lot more sensible. He's also likely to say something about the self-employed scheme. We think that's likely to be similar, where that you will have to reduce you'll only be allowed to maybe get 60% rather than 80% of your profits. But it remains to be seen, obviously.
Okay, we've got a question already that's come in about the self-employed scheme that I'll hit you with in a minute. But finally, on our episode last Tuesday of the Small Business Clinic, we started to talk about the bounceback loan application process, which by then had been running for 24 hours. I mean, in the week since we've last been on air, huge numbers of businesses have been getting support from the bounceback system.
Yeah, we heard at the weekend that £5 billion had been issued in these loans, and given the average loan size is 30 to 35,000 pounds. You're the personal finance editor, you can do the maths, Claire, but that's obviously, you know, hundreds of thousands of businesses that have been accessing these loans, and most of them getting the money within 24, 48 hours. It's been an incredibly successful scheme at the right time. The challenge is, you know, some people still have issues getting the application form done. There's only 14 banks doing it. If you don't bank with one of those banks, you're probably going to have to open an account with them first. So that it's not solved the problem for everybody, but I think it's the first. So that it's not solved the problem for everybody, but I think it's been a very welcome scheme that's worked remarkably effectively. And you know, I think back to our last financial crisis, you know, 2008-9, where the banks were really in the naughty corner, and lots of businesses felt they weren't on their side, and they were chasing them for money and putting them into administration. You know, the banks this time do seem to, so far, be playing a more supportive role of getting money out the door, you know, with fewer questions asked.
Brilliant. Well, talking of questions, they're already starting to come in from FT readers around the world, but mostly in the UK, who have got lots of different questions on all of the topics we're talking about today, starting with Jenny Maloney, who is writing to us from LinkedIn. She asks, the various business loans available and the delay of tax bills will all still need to be paid back eventually in a relatively short period of time. Have we got any indication of flexibility being shown by banks or HMRC, given the Bank of England's predictions of a crushing, if short, recession? Now, obviously, how to pay these loans back is a really big worry for lots of business lenders. The bounce back loan, you can get up to £50,000. Obviously, with the coronavirus business interruption loan, the bigger loans, C-bills, you know, they can run into the millions. But I think the important thing, Jenny, is that although with the bounce back loans, you don't have to make any repayments for 12 months, all of the money isn't due back at the end of that 12-month period. You've got a total of 6 years for that money to be repaid.
That's right, and it's only 2.5% interest, so it's relatively low. There is a caveat, though. I mean, I did talk to some business advisors last week who said, just think twice. You know, if you think your trading is going to suffer so much that you will struggle to repay this loan, you have to be very, very careful, because if the bank, although the bank can collect a guarantee from the government, they will come after you first. And if it's discovered by the administrator or liquidator of your business, you know, it's terrible to talk in these ways, but, you know, we have to face facts, that you'd acted irresponsibly and borrowed this money without any real plan of paying it back, then, you know, they could come and seize assets, and you could be banned from being a director for several years. So, you know, you do have to be careful. I mean, if you genuinely think that the sector you're in is not going to make a comeback within that 5-6 year framework, and you haven't got ways of paying that back, don't take the loan, because you know, it's not worth it.
Absolutely. Well, on a related question, Vena Hartirunyan on LinkedIn asks, are there any revenue tax exemptions for 2020 in the UK's tourism sector? Well, Vena, I don't know if you work in the tourism sector, but Andy, in relation to what you were saying, I mean, obviously there are some sectors of the UK economy, the global economy, that are going to be much harder hit than others and take longer to bounce back, to coin the Chancellor's term of phrase. I mean, tourism is not looking to really emerge from the lockdown anytime soon, whereas other businesses, where people are being encouraged to go back to work to try and reactivate, could be a more quicker turnaround.
Yeah, I think tourism, you know, most of the big companies, the airlines and so on, are talking about 2 to 3 years before we get back to normal. Imagine, you know, if social distancing might have to go on for up to a year till a vaccine is found. How can you run a hotel or a holiday park? You can't run it at the level you'd like to run it. You can still run it, but you're going to have to reduce the number of visitors coming to that park or hotel. So it is. Those sectors are going to be a big challenge. I mean, other things like, you know, retail, you'd probably have one person in the shop at a time and things like that for a long time to come. So you know, whereas factories, if you can manage your workforce and your workflow and stagger your shifts, you know, and you're making a product that's in demand, face mask, whatever it might be, you know, you could be booming. So yeah, I think it's best to imagine that most industries are going to be disrupted for 2 to 3 years.
And also, people on the Facebook, on the FT.com article, are talking about how to pivot businesses. For example, you've got a high street store, could you start a website and sell online? We've heard from a few businesses who have been able to do that. But FT reader Viper77, love the pseudonym, says he is thinking of applying for the bounce back loan. He has a bricks and mortar store in central London, but unfortunately 95% of the footfall is from office workers. And he says with office workers not returning to work for the foreseeable future, it's looking rather grim. I mean, classic case of a property story there. Quarter day coming up in June, lots of people in similar positions to Viper are going to be thinking, well, can I afford to pay the rent?
Yeah, I mean, just referring back to the earlier question, talked about what tax breaks are available. There's an awful lot of deferments. You don't have to pay your VAT bill, various other things, but a lot of these bills will have to be paid in time. Your rent, a lot of people can defer the rent because the landlord's not allowed to take you to court to get it back. You may be able to talk to your landlord and reduce your rent or get rent-free periods. I think you have to look at every single way you can to keep cash in the business, because that's going to be if you're running big expensive assets and you don't think you're going to get the revenue to run them in the future, you really have to consider what to do. And it may be that the landlord of that property can't imagine another use for it, and therefore will want to keep you in there and give you a deal. But office workers are not going to be coming back in the numbers they did probably ever, because we're all going to be flexibly working, a day or two at home, possibly a week for most people. At least for the next few years, this kind of video call will become more and more popular. So, I think that's a real challenge. But then is there another market around you that you could develop? Is there an online presence or a click and collect so that the office worker can come in on the day they are in the office and have something that they've pre-ordered?
Well, all useful thoughts there. We've actually heard from a landlord on LinkedIn. Julie Rosser says that she is struggling as a commercial landlord. She's being asked to offer a 3-month rent-free period or deferred rental payment to her commercial tenants. And with all the government support available for small businesses, she asks, does this seem appropriate? Well, great to hear from a landlord, Julie. Andy, what is your perspective on this dilemma?
Yeah, I did write a story a couple of weeks ago, actually, when a couple of smaller landlords came to me and said, Boots and Pound Stretcher at the time it was are not paying their rent, and yet they're still trading. They promptly slapped them with statutory notices, and of course, about 3 days later, the government said, "Oh, you can't do that." So, I do feel maybe it's tilted a little bit, away from landlords. It seems to be one of those sectors that the government has taken against to some extent, a bit like the self-employed or the people who pay themselves in dividends. There's a few sort of areas where the government seems to have decided, tough luck. So as we've said on this call before, you can keep lobbying through your MP. I think the key thing is to get across that you're not a sort of rapacious person who's just, sitting there pulling in the money, that there are costs involved with owning a building. And keep lobbying, really, but it is tough.
Well, one story that we've been following in the FT is, of course, the campaign from the restaurant and leisure industry, which is actually supported by commercial landlords, for the government to investigate offering a 3-month rental pause. Now, the argument there is that we've already heard in the early indications of how we'll come out of lockdown that it's going to be the busier, more crowded businesses, the restaurants, the pub trade, that are going to be the last to be allowed to reopen whenever that might be. And so there's a lot of desire to keep those businesses going by coming to some kind of accommodation. Now, we've had another comment from a reader on YouTube, Photo and Car Geek, love you, Monica. And he comments in the unlikely, I'm very sexistly assuming it's a man. He or she comments, in the unlikely case of global cooperation, would it be possible to press a global pause button that would pause all payments, make everyone looser but save businesses? So this could include pausing rents, debt repayments, bonds, etc., etc. That would save businesses, but also make the growth statistics not look that bad. Well, a nice idea, but I fear that the buck has got to stop somewhere. And I appreciate that with the restaurant initiative, it's something quite specific, designed to save a whole industry. just as we may have some kind of bailout eventually for the airlines has been spoken about. These are very specific industries in the line of fire because of all of the restrictions.
I think I remember reading, was it in Israel or somewhere, in many, back in the Holy Land days, they would have an annual forgiveness of debts, which I don't think in our current capitalist system is going to come back in, unfortunately.
Well, check out the Jubilee Debt Campaign if you want to read more on that, because they have a very similar ethos. Now, something completely different here for you, Andy, but a question I'm sure both of us with young adult children has been playing on my mind. Daniel Buckley from YouTube asks about students. He says, Claire and Andy, what are your general thoughts about university graduates joining the workforce this year?
Yeah, fortunately mine aren't quite at that age, but yeah, it's going to be pretty awful, because we know a lot of the big employers have cancelled their graduate recruitment programs. It's almost like a missed year. Having said that, I graduated in the middle of the 1990 recession. So, these things tend to take a year or two, but there will be opportunities out there again. And, the newer ways of working, one would hope that younger people are very adapted to, tech enhanced things, working with technology and so on, should suit them. So, and it might be that there are opportunities outside the normal. Think of the startups that are coming up with new products. Think of smaller employers that are finding new ways, as we said before, to adapt. Don't just look at the sort of classic milk round recruitment, which is inevitably going to be reduced.
Absolutely, and Justin, my only advice to you would be, perhaps think about going abroad. Now, I know that might sound a bit silly because we're all locked down at the moment, but as a young person, you don't have to start your career in the UK. Also think about the sector that you could be working in. Obviously, we've been talking about sectors like the airlines and retail, the restaurant trade, that are going to be very hard hit by this for some time to come. But then there are lots of other sectors of industry. I don't know what your degree is in, and it's important to remember that the economy isn't going to be like this forever. There's lots of ways that you can get skills and experience. Even if you're building up work experience, it is possible to survive that. But thanks for a very good question. And if any other readers have got things that they want to chip in, then please add your comments. I've got a couple of specific questions, Andy, which I'll group together about the experiences business leaders are having in applying for loans. Various people are saying that they are having problems applying for the CBILS loans. That's the coronavirus business interruptions loans. Things are taking longer than they expected. We also have another FT reader, Amy100, who asks how the government packages are even working. We're still waiting to hear back from our bank to offer the bounceback loan, and have approached another bank that we recently had to move from, and they don't offer the loan to anyone other than their existing clients. Time is running out, she says. So clearly, although there has been £5 billion worth of lending through the bounceback, some businesses are still experiencing quite a few issues.
Yeah, I mean, this whole issue of having to have an account with that bank is hard, because there's only 14 banks out there doing it, and it takes a week or so to get an account opened. So that is really tricky. I just think, most of these loans do get approved in time. So if there's any way that you can, keep your business going, hang on in there, cut your cash costs, any bills, pause, ask for your creditors to give you a bit of time. Because the other thing that's come through in this crisis, going back to the earlier point about debt forgiveness, actually, lots of suppliers I've talked to are, giving their people they supply to longer to pay. Lots of banks are offering extra finance. There are support. Business does want to help other businesses out, I think, in this crisis, which is very different to the 2009 sort of crisis, where everybody was just trying to gather in what they could while they could before everything collapsed. It seems to me that everybody's more looking to the future in this crisis and saying, well, in 6, 8, 9 months, I want this company I trade with to still be going, because, like we're saying about landlords, They might give you a bit of forgiveness on your rent because they want you to be there in 6 months' time. So just do everything you can to keep the business going until you get the answer from the bank, because you will get one in the end. I know it's tough, but as I say, the approval rates, I don't have them, the banks won't give them, but unlike CBILS is a different issue. Bounce back loans, we're talking about high approval rates. CBILS, I think the last figures I saw, at least 40% of at least surveyed British Chamber of Commerce members were being knocked back. So, that is CBILS is a tricky one. And, banks are being asked to lend in a tough climate where they're having to assess how successful you're going to be at the other end of it.
Okay, well, a question coming in now about the job retention scheme and all the furloughing, which we're going to hear from the Chancellor in about 15 minutes on. FT reader LadyDog70 says there are suggestions that the job retention scheme, which was due to end in May and was then extended until June, will be further extended in some way to September. Well, yes, Lady Dog, we await to hear announcements of that. She says, as far as I can see, the equivalent self-employed scheme, that's the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme, SEISS, is still only due to run until the end of May. What is the latest on that scheme? Well, anybody who is waiting for their payment, I have some good news for you. Obviously, things were going to be backdated for the months of March, April and May on the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme. And you should be receiving something, if you haven't done already, from HMRC, if you're eligible for that support, asking you to apply, which, as Andy said earlier, will give you up to 80% of your trading profits for those 3 months. But Andy, do you think that it's likely that this self-employed scheme could be extended along with the furlough scheme?
I think there will, famous last words, we'll find out in 10 minutes or so, but, the impression that's been given by the Treasury is that the two will march together still. So whatever happens with the employee scheme is likely to be reflected in the self-employed scheme, because you're in exactly the same situation.
Okay, and we've got another question on from Karen Harris via LinkedIn. She wants to make the point about the furlough scheme, that allowing workers to be furloughed part-time would have worked better. It's a shame that the government didn't allow some part-time working when on furlough, so that businesses could get work done behind the scenes. She said, well, Karen, I mean, it may well be that we'll hear some talk of greater flexibility from the Chancellor this afternoon.
Yeah, I think the Treasury has realised, they had to act swiftly, and they used the big gun, but actually something more pinpointed might have made sense, because it saves them money. If you're still willing to pay more of the wages to have somebody come in 1 day a week, 2 days a week, it saves the government money. So it's in their interest to make this tweak. And if I remember rightly, I think the Germans already had this kind of scheme, and were therefore just able to ramp it up, whereas we didn't, because they often use it for things like, manufacturing industry downtimes, and, if there's a volcano eruption or whatever, and the flights are disrupted, they have to put everybody off for, on short time working. They're already set up for that. So this might be something actually that they, potentially could run with in the future if something repeated itself. But I think they will finesse it.
Okay, well, lots and lots of comments coming in from our viewers on LinkedIn. Thank you very much for sending them through. Quite a few taking issue with two banks in particular, Barclays and Clydesdale, saying that their bounce back loan applications are being ignored. They're not communicating with customers. Well, we've covered this on the call already. We do hope that you'll hear back from your bank soon. It is a very difficult time as they are deluged with applications, but nevertheless, they should be in contact with their customers. Duncan Ray on LinkedIn says, do we know when we'll have more guidance or detail on the top-ups to local business grant funds scheme? Now, this was some extra millions, about £600 million announced last week. Now, again, Andy, that is all being disseminated through the individual councils. So if you were a business who missed out on getting a grant via the business rate system for being a small business that was exempt from business rates, that was the qualifying criteria, there is more funding available for people to apply for, particularly if they are in a shared office or a serviced office, as I understand it. So they're not individually on the business rates bills. But have you heard of any contacts who've successfully managed to get any of that money?
I haven't actually. I mean, I've heard from some who haven't, and I do think that councils. The slight problem is they'd be given a certain pot of money, which probably doesn't cover every case. So they're going to have some kind of system to assess whether you should get it or not. So that's going to take time. It's not as if they're just getting the money out the door as they did with the business grants. They just have to find you and get your bank details and send it to you. You know, it's a very, very different situation. So I think that one, sadly, you're going to have to show some patience. And obviously, we'll keep writing about it and finding out what councils are up to. But, you know, councils themselves are struggling to keep going. They're having to open waste tips this week. They're having to, you know, all sorts of government guidance is being flung at them. They're trying to get the grants out the door and the business rates first, and then they're going to move on to this. So with the best will in the world, it's probably going to be a few weeks, I would have thought.
And if there's anyone watching who has got the money, or people who work for councils, for local authorities, do post a comment. We always go back to these articles afterwards and look through the comments, even if we don't read it out on screen. It will really help our reporting of these issues if you can tell us what your own experiences are. So some more companies some more comments, sorry, back on LinkedIn. Can you clear the air, says Dominique, on misinformation about the virus spreading via cash? Several businesses have banned cash payments because of this. Well, I would go further than that. I would say the majority of businesses, certainly in London where I live, are not taking cash. And some of them, sadly, had already started to do that long before the pandemic swept in. But there is generally, you know, I don't know if there was anything more specific, Andy, in any of the guidance you read last night about cash, but certainly people are very down on cash as a payment method at the moment. Yeah,
sadly, I don't think that's going to change. There's nothing to say people shouldn't take cash. I think there's an advice to use cards, which the government's given, but it's not. It's an interesting one because I don't know for sure whether businesses who say I'm not taking your cash are allowed to do that. I guess they probably are, and it's become a default mechanism. I think the truth is that, you know, you are more likely to, obviously, if you handle something and hand it to somebody else and you've got the virus, then, you know, it does survive on materials. Copper actually only survives a few hours on, but, you know, other forms of metal, it can be up to 24 hours. So there is a natural reticence, I would argue. And even using cash machines, an ATM, I don't feel great about, you know, touching an ATM, pinching my number in when lots of other people have done it, you know. I wash my hands afterwards. It's just the way it is, unfortunately.
Okay, Zeke Hughes on LinkedIn has come up with a bright idea. He says, have you heard of any small business owners who've talked to larger corporations about using their available space on a reduced or deferred payment plan? So like subletting some excess space from a bigger business. Large businesses are obviously rethinking their office space strategies, which will likely be significantly reduced. Well, interesting idea, Zeke, although I guess the challenge is going to be entrances, social distancing, all of the problems that we've been hearing about at the top of the video today.
Yeah, and there are companies already out there, actually, which are sort of office brokers, where if you've got some spare space, you can go to them and they will match you with a tenant that wants to use it. So this does still exist, but as Claire says, you've got the social distancing challenge. So even if places have spare space, they might actually want the spare space because, you know, they'll need it to house even the fewer number of workers that they have.
And a serious question raised by Thomas Garulis on LinkedIn. He says some companies are very hesitant welcoming employees back too soon due to fears of litigation, corporate manslaughter or similar, further down the line should anyone unfortunately pass away due to COVID-19 contracted at work. How can the government ensure these concerns are addressed early on to discourage ambulance chasers weighing in on this, whilst also ensuring safe working environments and mitigated damage to the economy? Well, I mean, it's an impossible question. And also knowing where you were, where you contracted the virus, obviously leaving your house and going to work, depending on the sort of job that you do, it's going to put you at more risk. Some very disturbing statistics on that this week. But in reality, you could catch the virus anywhere.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think this will weigh on a lot of employers' minds because, you know, they're being told you need to social distance, you need to take this into account, you need, you know, the health and safety legislation says your workers have to be safe at work. Nobody has actually put in law, as far as I can see, if somebody catches coronavirus in your office and you haven't done X, Y, Z, then you are liable. But of course, lawyers will be lining up to make those points. A lot of people have been talking about Health and Safety Act. I think it is a Section 44 people talk about, where, you know, you can walk off the job if you don't feel safe. Now, you know, it's very different to saying I'm 2 meters, you know, I'm more than 2 meters closer to my neighbor worker than, you know, past cases of, you know, you're asking me to jump off a cliff or whatever, you know. I mean, you know, or lift something that's far too heavy. So it's a whole new area. I mean, the Health and Safety Executive has been given 10 million quid to improve. It's, you know, to try and police all this. And if I was an employer, I'd probably run my plans, if I could, past them and just say, this is what I'm planning to do. You know, is that okay?
Yes, and obviously lots of discussion in the documents that were released last night about how workers and bosses should try to come to a consensus and agree what is happening, although how successful that will be remains to be seen. We have one insight from Kitan Kemisola on LinkedIn, who shares his views from Nigeria. Hi, Kitan, thanks for commenting. He says it's really challenging here in Nigeria. There's no relief funds raised for small business owners or citizens, and things are in no way back to normal. Well, I guess that could be a poignant point for us to wrap up on, Andy, because as much as the challenges are facing small businesses in Britain, at least we do have quite a lot of options for business owners to get help and support from the government.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough in those countries, and we just wish everybody well. I know it's hard running a business at the best of times in some economies, and I can only hope that there's sort of fortitude and skill that people show day to day, getting their businesses through. They can have, you know, throughout this crisis, and let's hope we all get back to normal sooner rather than later.
Okay, well, thank you to everyone who has commented on the video today. As I said, we'll go back and monitor the comments that you've been leaving on YouTube and LinkedIn and the article if you've got an idea for a topic that you'd like us to go into more detail next week or investigate more thoroughly for the stories that me and Andy are writing in the FT. But thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you back next week, 12 o'clock, for your usual appointment with the FT Business Clinic. Meanwhile, let's see what the Chancellor has to say now about extending the furlough scheme. Thanks very much.